debate? Further debate? The member for Thornhill.
Thank you very much, Speaker. And the first thing I want to do is I want to make it clear that I will be sharing my time with the member from Durham because the clock's going to run out around 6 o'clock and this debate won't resume till tomorrow. So the member from Durham will continue. And I can't help but start by doing what would be the equivalent of a 2-minute comment on the presentation by my opposite number, the parliamentary assistant, my friend from Vaughan, because he made a couple of comments that are worthy of some reaction. And what he said basically was, and I made some notes, we were supposed to, here on this side, want to read this and work on it together, that one way or another he would hope that we would engage in some reconsideration. But I've got to say that he was going on the premise that somehow or other we're voting against a budget in this. And we've made it clear from the outset that we will not be voting against a budget. In fact, on the floor of this House, when the question is called, of course, we will vote no on the budget. But what we're voting against is a government. We're voting against the way the Liberal government does business. We cannot any longer accept it. I said in my speech yesterday when we were talking about the budget motion, what we said, why don't you be quiet for a change? You know, you're very noisy. Okay? In any event, we're voting against the government.
Order.
You made it a
Order.
You've been here for 8 months. Sorry.
Order. The member for Thornhill.
Thank you, Speaker. The member for Vaughan said that he'd been here for 8 months. I've been here for closer to 8 years at this point. And that doesn't mean I'm smarter than him. It means I've been around longer. This would be, I guess, the 7th budget that I've heard from this government, if you don't count the ones that came before I arrived in this chamber. And you know what? In some ways, this is the same budget that you always present, and it's in many ways the same budget that we've come to expect. It talks about how you're going to create jobs, and it talks about how you're going to calm the economy and turn things around. And when it doesn't talk about what you're going to do, it talks about what the world has done to create the situation that poor Ontario finds itself in. He also talks about the fact that he would like to see a hospital materialize in his riding. That's the same hospital that I want in Vaughan, and hospitals in general. Thornhill wants that too. He wants transit to expand, and he believes that this budget will allow for transit to expand. I don't see that, but I just as much want transit to expand as my friend from Vaughan. I want the same great health care and education as my friend from Vaughan wants. But you know what? With a budget like that, we have no right and no business to expect that to happen. So that's my response to his request for reconsideration. I have a problem in reconsidering anything when it comes to the budgets that come out of this particular government. As I was beginning to say, I quoted Einstein's theory on the definition of insanity, which is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And that's precisely what this government has done over the period of time, at least the period of time that I found myself present in this House. Now let me say, Speaker, to go to my own notes. I was handed, as I always am by my staff, a series of speaking points that I might want to work from that are based on what I wanted to say. And I kind of rejected them when a couple of things came along over the course of recent time. And I didn't write these, and my staff didn't write them, but there are a couple of newspaper columnists that did, and I'd like to read pieces of these into the record because they so address the situation we find ourselves in. And one comes from what my friends over there...
Conversations, please take them out of the chamber.
Thank you, Speaker. One of them comes from a paper that would be characterized by my friends on the other side as leaning more right, and the other one comes from a paper that we would characterize as leaning more left, so I think it's appropriate to put some of these comments on the record. This one is in the Financial Post, it comes from Friday's edition, day after the budget, and it's written by Jason Clemens and Niels Veldhuis, and it's entitled, "It's Not Our Problem, Ontario Liberals Kick Deficit Down the Road." And so the salient points I want to put on record read as follows. The May 2nd minority Liberal budget is a politically expedient document that likely avoids an election, but unfortunately fails to tackle Ontario's looming fiscal crisis. The longer the province waits, the more difficult and painful the reforms will be when the inevitable day of reckoning arrives. Minister of Finance Charles Sousa was quick to trumpet the $5 billion improvement in last year's 2012-2013 deficit, which came in at $9.8 billion instead of the original $14.8 billion. Of course, what he didn't mention is that over half of the improvement came about from one-time events, including a $1.2 billion boost in corporate tax revenues from tax assessments for years prior to the $1.5 billion in savings from reducing liabilities associated with public sector sick day banking. That would be the teachers. In addition, Minister Sousa failed to mention that the budget projects a worse deficit in 2013-14 when the deficit is expected by his figures to increase to $11.7 billion. It goes on to say, clearly the Liberals are kicking the can down the road. Isn't that an interesting phrase? My leader, Tim Hudak, has used that so many times. But these are independent writers. And when they get there, they simply kick it further. Subheadline, an inability to control spending came through loud and clear. The unfortunate history is critical since a significant part of the Liberal, quote, plan, unquote, for deficit reduction is premised on the government's future ability to strain spending growth and rein in compensation. Beyond that, the Liberals will need decent economic growth, stable increases in revenues, and continuing low interest rates. In short, it's not a plan grounded in reality. Final paragraph that I want to read from this particular article is a recent analysis by University of Guelph economist Ross McKittrick calculated that Ontario's electricity prices will soon be near the highest in North America, if not the highest. Passing a budget when a government is in minority is always a tricky business. Unfortunately, all of the serious problems of deficits, debt, competitiveness, and energy prices were deferred to the future.
Get rid of the turbines.
That's what writers who are independent thinkers wrote in the Financial Post last week about this budget. So I said that I was going to deal with some sources that were a little bit unorthodox. That was one of them. This one's really unorthodox because it's more a source that I would expect to hear from Liberals than I would from Conservatives. More importantly, it comes from the Toronto Star, which some of us here on this side occasionally think is almost the house organ of the Liberal Party. I've heard people say of the Toronto Star, you would be better informed if you read no newspaper than if you read the Toronto Star. I'm not saying that, especially this time. This is an editorial in today's paper, no less than today's paper, written by Martin Reg-Con, who works here at Queen's Park. He is the fellow who writes the editorials that are based on the goings-on in this place. In other words, political commentary on Ontario, and it's captioned, "It's about the economy, Charles Sousa." Now, as people here know, that's a play on a quote that comes from James Carville, also known as the Ragin' Cajun speaker. And that quote goes back to Clinton days. And what he had originally said was, "It's about the economy, stupid." Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment, Speaker, that we should equate the word stupid with Charles Sousa. The man is not. He's the finance minister. I respect his title, and I frankly respect him. So I'm not calling the minister stupid, but I'm calling his motivation into question with the budget that he has presented. And I would have to say that at this point, what we've got is a brand new finance minister who is the victim of his own party, and he's demonstrating a certain level of ineptness in how he's handled this. And I think, without putting words in Reg-Con's mouth, that that's what he's trying to say. So I'd like to put some of what Martin Reg-Con has placed on the record in our record here on Hansard. And he says, the big story in Ontario's budget isn't the political concessions to the NDP. Nor is it the austerity measures aimed at eliminating the deficit. The real news relates to our slumping economy and the sense that no one in government or the private sector knows how to deal with it. Finance Minister Charles Sousa argued in his budget speech that eliminating the deficit is the, quote, single most important step, unquote, the government can take to revive the economy. But it's not the only step. Eliminating the deficit is a means to an end, not an end in itself. He goes on to talk about what happened on the agenda the other night. I was on that program along with my colleague from the NDP and the minister himself. And what they were putting on the screen, according to, I didn't see what was on the screen, I was sitting in the studio, but according to Mr. Reg Khan was NDP demand, Liberal response, and everything was captioned asked and answered. The finance minister seemed clueless about how to deal with the bigger challenges in his debut budget. It's about the economy, Sousa. Again, this is coming from Martin Reg Khan. It's a tale of declining productivity, competitiveness, research and development, and machinery investment amid soaring labour output costs. Ontario's economy will grow by a paltry 1.5% in 2013, our third consecutive decline year over year, and well behind the United States, running at 2.1%. While the U.S. remains the major destination for Ontario's goods, our share of American imports is roughly half what it was in 2000. Hitch our wagon to the listless U.S. market, we can barely keep pace. Is there a way to balance the budget while bolstering economic growth? New Democrats and some economists on the left believe stimulus is the only answer, deficit be damned. Tories and business economists call for tax cuts. Again, deficit be damned. This is according to Reg Khan again. One recent analysis from the Institute for Competitiveness and Prosperity Institute for Competitiveness and Prosperity argues that Ontario must rein in the deficit because of rising interest costs, but should also ramp up educational spending because it lags other provinces per capita. It also calls for more investment in infrastructure, such as transit, because it pays future dividends. And finally, he says, government can help set the table, but it can't single-handedly instill an entrepreneurial spirit in Ontario's commercial classes. And to that, the member for Thornhill, Peter Shurman, says, but you know what? Setting that table properly makes the guests want to come for dinner. And that's what our party is about. It's about saying, if we balance the budget and we generate on the part of the credit rating agencies, and if we put out the word to the world around us and to entrepreneurs who live here amongst us that it's okay to spend money because there's stability here, there's a steady workforce that wants to work, then we start to prosper. That's not what this budget is saying, and it has been consistently for the past 10 budgets over 9.5 years, not what that government is saying, and that's why we don't support the budget, and that's why we said before the budget came down, and we could even see it, why we were not prepared to support that government. In terms of reading the budget, and this is not the first time you'll hear this from me because there are going to be some question periods ahead, we read this budget. We read it really well. I question, Speaker, whether or not any members over on that side who are going to debate this budget bothered reading word one, because they were told, this is the Kool-Aid, you drink it and you vote for it, because that's what they always do. Well, let me refer to the notes that my compatriots upstairs have dutifully prepared now that I've gone almost 15 minutes, courtesy of the people who write in the various newspapers. One of the things that hasn't been touched upon by anybody so far, other than to say that we did it, is that there is a committee called the Standing Committee on Finance and Economic Affairs. For the people who are viewing us at home, it's worth saying that we use an acronym SCOFIA, which is the first letter of each of the words that I just cited. And that committee, SCOFIA, traveled the province to find out what people around the province, stakeholders around the province, organizations, whether they were poverty organizations, corporate organizations, Native people, whoever it may have been, had to say about what should happen in the budget process. Ostensibly, Speaker, those trips generate information that are supposed to inform the budget process, that are supposed to be given to the minister, that the minister reads and in formulating his budget considers. And I would have to say, Speaker, that because in a parallel universe, the finance minister is running his own private hearings, and we out here, we mere MPPs on the other side of the House, have no way of knowing who he even talked to or what process informed his budget, other than the party over here to my left. I don't know whether he read anything that came out of our report from the Standing Committee on Finance and Economic Affairs, SCOFIA. I don't think he did. And so I certainly intend to put some of those things into the record as I speak here today. So I'll start with a quote. "You cannot dig your way out of a ditch. You cannot eat your way thinner. And, Minister, you cannot spend to reduce a deficit." What a great quote. And it came from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. That's what it comes down to. That's the kind of thing that you have to listen to. These are people who represent other people. That's the nature of the traveling that we do. That's the reason why we take taxpayer money and we spend it well, which is by paying for travel at a modest rate and staying in modest hotels and eating modest meals and listening to people who have spent their own money or their organization's money to come and see us and say, here's what we found, and here's what we think, and here's what we think you ought to do. And wouldn't it be nice, Speaker, if once in every little while these people got listened to? Instead, who was listened to? The third party with 7 demands so that that party could stay in power. And that's the budget that you want us to vote for and support. I don't think so. The solutions to Ontario's problems are not hard to figure out. My leader said this, so I'll tell you who I'm quoting, and he's right. Solutions to these problems, they're not hard to figure out. They're just not easy to do. Ontario needs a government that has a plan to reduce spending, to create jobs, and the courage to implement it, and you can't just say you have one and make it so. You have to actually have one. For the past year and a half since the last election, which, hey, look, we got 36 members here and you got more than that, so you won it, even if you have a minority. We know that. We decided that we were going to win the next one, and we understand what the mistakes are that we made, so we started to address them. And for a year and a half, the people sitting around me and all of the people who represent the caucus here and our leader Tim Hudak and legions of progressive conservatives around this province have participated in a process that has produced a series of white papers. No, those white papers are not the additive completion of our platform. They are a way of consulting properly, not on a 1-800 number, but properly with people in Ontario who want to say something about how their government should work. And by putting out white papers, we tried all of those ideas, and not all of them were accepted. Some of them were. And at a given point in time, in 2 weeks or 2 months or a year or whenever it happens to be, there will be an election. And the amalgam of the ideas that came across to us as positive will be put into a platform, and that's what will go out against there, and it will properly reflect what the people in Ontario believe. And as a result of that, I expect my party will wind up going to the other side, and you guys are going to be over here.
That's right. Outside looking in.
Anyway, that's us progressive conservatives. And I want to say something else about progressive conservatives. In the course of Finance Minister Seuss's comments to the media, in the course of Budget Day, when we were all in the lockup, I took the occasion to watch the minister carefully and listen to what it was he had to say. And he went to some considerable lengths and spent some considerable time talking about the alternatives that people had. They can either accept the budget that he's presented as something that actually would stimulate the economy, actually would create jobs and all the rest of it, or they could go with our party, which really engages in slash and burn politics. This is the word that's always put across to us. Why don't you be quiet too, for a change, right?
Member for Vaughan.
Believe that that's acceptable behaviour or parliamentary behaviour from the member from Thornhill. That's twice now in his remarks today that he's done that.
The member for Thornhill to continue.
I'll respond to that, Speaker, in the course of my comments.
Just, continue with your remarks. Thank you.
That's fine. Slash and burn. Slash and burn. What is it that the party on the other side actually thinks that this party's about? Do you think that we're going to close all of the schools and your kid's not going to get an education? Do you think that we're going to close down hospital beds and we're going to let people die? What is it you think we're going to do? Here's what we are going to do. Here's what you're talking about means to us. It means something that you people have no concept about, and that is when you take in an amount of money, that's the amount of money that you have to spend. And that's called balancing a budget. And because of the mess that party has made, it'll take us some time to do it, but we think we can do it in about 2 years. It'll be hard, it'll be heavy lifting, but it can be done. And that's what we intend to do. So when we get accused of slash and burn and what nonsense that is, in terms of how we would deal with Ontario, I get incensed. And sometimes when you hear an outburst from me or another member on my side, that's what it's about, because we're misaccused of motives that are less than noble, and we're misaccused of being able to run the province as well, and I certainly think better than that province has done. And we have 10 years of history by way of the proof point. So I'm really quite tired of hearing about that. Too many people in Ontario at this point are having trouble finding work, and what's happening here is they're losing hope in their province. They're losing hope in their province, and we call that the Fort McMurray syndrome. Exactly. My colleague from Leeds Grenville has 2 sons working in Fort McMurray. I have a son who's out in northern British Columbia. Why are our kids out there? Why are our kids out there? Because they want to see the mountains, or because they want to play with oil in Fort McMurray? Could be, but mostly they're out there because they can't get jobs here. That's what it is. Look, Speaker, we have been downgraded as a province. We've been downgraded by Moody.
Order! I would ask the members to come to order. The member for Thornhill.
Thank you. We as a province have been downgraded by Moody's. We've been downgraded by S&P. We've lost 300,000 well-paying manufacturing jobs, high-paying manufacturing jobs. And we have seen many companies pack up and leave very recently, as a matter of fact, a couple more. Our province at this point has almost 600,000 people who are looking for work. 600,000 of our brothers and sisters who want to work and haven't been able to find a job. As I said, very recently we have some examples. Just this past weekend, it was announced that more good manufacturing jobs were lost. 330 Caterpillar workers in Toronto will be receiving severance packages. That comes after 500 jobs were lost at that same company's plant in London last year. Instead of taking necessary action, what did our Premier Kathleen Wynne do? She used the 2013 provincial budget to take us on the same failed Dalton-McGuinty approach as the last decade.
Magical mystery tour.
It is now clear that the only way to help Ontario become strong again is to set a new course with a new team. A new course with a new team. It's time, Ontario. It is time. No, you know what? They don't. I want to say they don't have a new government. They have a new premier with a team that has not even begun to gel. That's not a new government. That is a recycled old government, and let that be understood. And it's really, I might say, Speaker, it's quite a shame that the new government, which was touted as a new government by that very same Premier when she came in here and talked about collaboration, has not come across as a new government. It's come across as a recycled one with a new Premier who has no mandate to govern because she hasn't gone to the polls. So you know, let's talk about that way. Let's do it that way. I see little to no input was actually taken into account when looking at the recommendations that we heard at the Standing Committee on Finance and Economic Affairs to what the Minister tabled on May 2nd, that's last Thursday. And as far as I can see, From his own exclusive and private consultations, he probably hasn't taken much into consideration either. This bill, Bill 65, is called Prosperous and Fair Ontario Act. Prosperous and Fair Ontario Act. They're applauding. Last year, it was called Strong Measures for Ontario. Now, they have an incredible proclivity for picking titles. I've noticed this in the titles of their bills.
The Justice Society.
They said that they were going to use strong measures last year. The strong measures that come to mind immediately were they were going to deal with their unions 4,000 collective agreements to create 0% wage increases. They didn't need to freeze wages, which was something that our party was in favor of. In fact, it's the subject of a bill I presented, and it's something that our party is still in favor of, not because we're interested in union busting, but because we think a fair and level playing field is an appropriate way to go. They said they weren't going to do that. They were going to talk to their partners, and they were going to get it done. First example of that, they go to the teachers. They bring Bill 115 onto the floor of this legislature. We say, well, not the best bill there ever was, but something that we could support because it at least goes partway towards a goal that we have. Along comes the new government, and the new government takes one Bill 115, and for all intents and purposes is out the window. Okay, that was strong measures. Strong measures. They brought in at least some passing reference to a change in interest arbitration, the ability for towns and cities, for example, to deal with their employees through an arbitration process that had some teeth and worked. Okay, and guess what? The NDP, which they were trying to cooperate with to get their support last year, gutted that, and the Liberals went along. We did, and you're quite correct, we voted against it, but for an entirely different reason. We voted against it because they gutted it. Yep. So for two different reasons at cross purposes, we voted against it, wasn't going to go along. We could have voted with the government, wouldn't have provided any teeth anyway. We also saw measures in that strong measures budget that looked at privatization of some government services. NDP gutted that. Okay, it wouldn't vote along with it. We even voted for that piece of it, the privatization piece, but they haven't done anything with it. So those were the strong measures. I guess they're gone. So if history informs the past, I've got to say that strong measures never occurred as a result of that budget any more than a prosperous and fair Ontario are going to occur as a result of this budget. This budget is basically unfair to the dozens of deputants that were heard before SCOFIA, the Standing Committee on Finance and Economic Affairs. We heard from them all across the province. We traveled to Ottawa, we traveled to Timmins, we traveled to Windsor, we traveled to Thunder Bay. We heard from, I guess, a couple of hundred different deputants from all aspects of society. And let me put some of those things on the record, if I can find them. They're here somewhere. Well, I will find them. How's that? I did. Chemistry Industry Association of Canada. They said, we take raw resources and we produce usable products. We are a $16 billion industry in total. This is a supply industry for other sectors, so it drives other economic activity. Development has to have a clear plan to reduce development. We're talking about development in Ontario. There has to be a clear plan to reduce the deficit and debt so it assumes a smaller portion of the offset. Interest rates are at risk. Ontario could be faced with continued deficits and growing debt. Could be a lose-lose-lose scenario for the province. There is a correlation between deficit and job losses, and corporate tax rate is an issue. That was the chemistry industry. That's a large industry. $16 billion is an awful lot of money. Sarnia, that's right. My friend from Sarnia points out that it affects his area. Here was a completely different presentation. These were two young guys, really brilliant. Ontario Economic Development Society. They were looking for funding to promote a business they've already started that already has achieved a modicum of success, and it was for social media funding. And they said Ontario has to take action on business creation. The Ontario Chamber of Commerce and the Ottawa Chamber of Commerce were on board with this idea. They presented in Ottawa. They said they need a better environment to access capital. And what they wanted us to do was legalize crowdfunding. Some people who are watching us and who are in this chamber, some people on the outside will understand what crowdfunding is. It is already a fact of life in other jurisdictions, but it has to have registration with the OSC. They have Kickstarter.com online right now, 159 million raised for entrepreneurs. That's a crowdfunding site. We have to get on board with that in Ontario. So again, that was a great idea that came from some people who came before Scofia. I see none of that stuff appearing in the budget. Here was the Timmins Economic Development Corporation. So this is basically municipal government or an adjunct to municipal government. And they're saying they want to see land-based gaming and modernization. They were disappointed that Timmins was not selected to host a casino. Willing and a host community that has a central location for the surrounding region of the north. And what they're talking about is because Xstrata relocated, they lost $3.4 million in revenue and they lost 678 direct jobs. And they're a large visitor base to sustain a small casino for the north. So they said that they would like to be considered for that. And they also said something we heard an awful lot in the north. And I'll read some more of these later. But the price of electricity, they said, is too high. And government is directly controlling the standard of living in the province. These are things, amongst others, that came forward as the committee traveled the province. And these are the things that we haven't seen addressed to any reasonable degree by this government in this budget. Regrettably, the many and varied first-hand consultations at those hearings were not taken into account in any of the development of this budget, as far as we can see. This budget is unfair to the hard-working people of this province, because basically what you've done is you've denied them hope. That's what it is. It's about hope. If you're going to put together a budget and you're going to put people back to work, you have to give them some hope. You haven't done that. You haven't done that. You've made concessions basically to a socialist party on my left in a bid to stay in power. That's what you did.
Cost $1 billion.
Okay, and if you take a look at the budget bill that we're debating and you compare it to other budget bills, every budget bill I've seen in the past, the one last year, they were that thick. People on camera can see it. This year it's that thick. Why is that the case, Speaker? Because they don't want that kind of debate going on. You can holler all you want, but
I'd ask you, first of all, you're not in your own seat, and second of all, you do not have the right to talk to the person across. You talk through the chair. Is that clear?
I apologize.
Thank you. Member for Thornhill.
anyway, Speaker, it is quite clear to me that what has been done by the Liberals with the budget bill itself, there's a common trend with the Liberal Party at this point that what it does, and it does this not just in a budget bill, but it does it in many bills, is they talk about grandiose ideas, and then they do nothing to show that there's any accountability for delivering on those ideas. And accountability is not there for a very simple reason, and it's because you aren't accountable. You aren't. You don't hold yourself accountable. You don't take responsibility. Look, I'll give a perfect example to the people watching us. We must have asked, and we haven't kept count, well, maybe somebody's kept count, dozens and dozens of times whether or not the Premier of this province apologizes for her complicit involvement in the cancellation of a couple of power plants. And she keeps standing up and saying, I have said, Speaker, I regret that this happened. Well, I'm going to tell you something, Speaker. So do I. I regret it. Regretting is not being sorry. I regret that that party did what it did. So does Kathleen Wynne, the Premier. But she's supposed to say, I apologize. I'm sorry. I used your money, taxpayers, to do this. I didn't do that. She did. Dalton McGuinty did. But here we are. Here we are, Speaker. I regret. The numbers don't lie. The minister, and these are numbers from his own document, on page 109 of that document, the numbers are as follows. So let's just make sure that we put them on the record. In 2010, the deficit was $14 billion. I'll say it again for the benefit of the Attorney General.
He's flipping.
He's flipping pages. This is page 109. So have I. Page 109. 2010 deficit $14 billion. 2011 deficit $13 billion. 2012 deficit of $9.8 billion. That's the one that you applauded the other day. That's the one from the year just over, and that's the one that I said earlier is contrived. And it's contrived because of one-time revenue and the movement of reserves. Otherwise, it would have been larger. How can I make the proof point for that? By saying that in 2013, the budget that's just been tabled, the increased deficit is $11.7 billion. And this is a government that says that about 4 years out, 2017-18, it's going to deliver a zero on the bottom line, and that would be a good thing if it could, because that's called a balanced budget. But we've also proven in debate yesterday that they can't. And they can't because there's no change in expenses for the 4 years leading up to 2017-18. They have no intention of raising or lowering expenses. It's just going to be sitting there at $118 billion. So between 2010 and 2012, if I can go back to the figures I've just mentioned, revenue actually increased by $7 billion, despite the fact that the deficit decreased by only $4.2 billion. They did in that period of time what they're still doing now. They increased spending every single year in excess. They never really presented anything of an austerity budget, and we weren't looking for an austerity budget. What we were looking for was for them to actually keep spending in check. But they didn't, and they're still not. And that's why I'm standing up here and decrying the fact that we're not moving out of the same sphere that they've operated in for all those years. So that's some pretty fancy accounting, if you ask me, and I guess it really begins to explain the budget bill. This bill about a future full of prosperity. Budget bills usually are what I described before. They're huge omnibus bills, acts within acts and clauses within clauses that take incredible amounts of debate during the period in committee after second reading before they finally come back to third. They contain dozens of schedules to clearly demonstrate to not only the opposition parties, but more importantly, the people of Ontario, how the government plans on spending their hard-earned tax dollars in the coming year. So once again, accountability seems to be some fictitious concept to the McGuinty-Wynne Liberals. Accountability in government is everything. And the reason why people on the outside right now have not a lot of faith in politicians generally, I have to say it, is because they look at us and they judge us by the people who have been elected for a lengthy period of time to run what's going on. And they say, my God, if they can do that, won't you all? Speaker, I went canvassing over the weekend. I wanted to take the temperature in the riding of Thornhill. I got people at the door. And I purposely picked an area of my constituency that was not particularly blue. It was more pink, more red the last time around. Hundreds, actually hundreds. I had a big team. And we got a sense that there's a turn in areas where we knew by our walk sheets that people had voted for the other party, the last time in 2011. We saw a move to our party or to, at the very least, undecided, and we got a very good feeling from that in terms of my re-electability. And that's all we were really testing. It's not scientific, but what we heard is even more important. We heard from people who wanted to engage us that they were really disgusted with the nonsense that's gone on of late. And they know about Orange, and they know about e-health. They even go back to, we won't raise your taxes, and then getting something that wasn't a tax after all. It was called a health premium that never then and never since has been spent on health. And now they know about buying off two companies that were building power plants that had to be cancelled. And the House Leader for the government stands up every day in question period, and he says, those parties wanted to cancel the power plants too. No, those parties wanted to react as they did to what was going on in those constituencies in terms of dealing with what people wanted. But here's what the parties on this side didn't do. We didn't try to hide the cost of what it would be if we had gone ahead and done it. And that's what they never admit to. It's not a question of having cancelled the power plants. It's the motive at the time, and it's the cost being hidden at the time and for many, many months afterwards that required incredible sleuthing on the part of this party. And that, again, Speaker, goes to accountability. So let me get back directly to the budget. With such a thin budget bill, I have to ask how the Liberals intend on actually enacting anything that was promised in the budget. Very proudly, said the minister, you will hold spending to 1.5%. It's right there in black and white, again on page 109 of your budget, yet there is no indication whatsoever anywhere in that book of how you plan on doing that in this bill. So where's the accountability there? The Premier has stood up in this House saying that there is, and I'm not quite quoting but I'm paraphrasing, no money for much-needed projects, funding for autism, better social services throughout the province. I myself stood up during the debate of a supply motion, must be a month ago, 6 weeks ago, and I talked about a woman in my riding, Laura Kirby McIntosh, who has a son who is severely autistic and with whom she has a problem, and he's 14. And it was only because I stood up and spoke in this House that the CCAC immediately came to the fore and handed her some temporary relief, but other than that, she couldn't be heard. So is that what it takes for an MPP to stand up in the House in debate and actually say something in order for one person to get help? And last week, I think we all know of the tragedy in Ottawa where a mom had to take her 19-year-old autistic son and literally give him away because she was at the end of her tether. How can we countenance this in the province of Ontario? How is it possible that this can be even happening in our midst? Shame. Yet these people on the other side who claim to be accountable can be spending like drunken sailors. 2013 revenue is $116 billion. That is up $2.6 billion from the previous year. Expenses are increasing by $3.6 billion to $127.6 billion. Hence, the accusation, because it's true by your own admission, that you continue to spend in larger degree than what you take in. And you continue to generate deficits that are larger than the year before. That is what you term controlled spending. It's not. There's nothing controlled about it. It's just spending. But it's what you do. It's in your DNA. And that, Speaker, is why this party made a conscious decision, and I think a very principled decision, not to support the government. It's not about a budget anymore. It's about a way of life. And that way of life has to stop in Ontario. Because if it doesn't stop in Ontario, even people with a plan, that's us, even people with a plan are going to have a really hard time taking over government and fixing anything. And that represents a clear and present danger to everybody who lives in Ontario, because right now there are a bunch of people sitting here in this House. I think the youngest one is in his 30s, probably if Monty Quinter were here, be in his 80s, but the point is represents a range of age groups. We're not in a position at our age to fix this anymore. So who's going to fix it? Our kids are going to fix it. Our grandkids are going to. Somebody's going to have to. This is kind of like you have a credit card, and you keep a balance on it, you keep it maxed out until one day when you finally leave this earth, as we all are absolutely going to do. And somebody's still got to pay that debt. So who's going to do it? Your estate, if you have one, but I suspect if you have a credit card with 10 or 20 grand on it, you haven't got much of an estate, so it's going to be your kid. And that's what's going to happen in the province of Ontario on a grand scale. Correct me if I'm wrong, Minister, but how are you paying for programs that you say you're providing when you aren't taking in the money to cover those programs?
That's right.
I notice in the budget bill that one clause calls for the creation of an ability to borrow up to $24.4 billion. That would be described, if we were in committee or if we were asking a question on the floor of this House, as business in the normal course. Government has to have an ability to pay its bills, so they need a credit line capable of paying up to $24.4 billion. So I said to myself, gee, I wonder why that's there. And then I realized, I'm the finance critic, I got this figured out. They have a deficit projected of $12 billion, and there's probably $12 billion out there that they haven't collected in taxes, so they figure that maybe at the max they're going to need $24 billion in credit line to operate in the coming year. Doesn't that worry you a little bit? Yep. Worries me, because I don't know if $24 billion is enough the way these people go. They never manage to keep the spending in check, so if they say they're going to spend $3.6 billion, my guess is they'll probably spend 5 or 6. How is it that there was always money to save Liberal interests, but when real urgent programs are required, the money runs out? We don't know the final answer to what happened in Oakville. And we're not going to get that till sometime in the summer. And it could be $600 million, $700 million, maybe it's $1 billion, and we're going to find that out. But whatever it was, that money was there, as was, per the Auditor General, $275 million to stop the construction out in Mississauga, as was $1 billion to take care of a bunch of friends who were going to build us an e-health system. I haven't seen that e-health system. Okay? My doctor put in his own e-health system, but I haven't seen an e-health system that comes from the province of Ontario.